Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and Ken is taking a well-earned vacation at the moment, a well-earned break, but I'm joined on this special edition podcast by Derek Cunningham from the CPCAB, who's we're going to try together, Derek, aren't we, to kind of demystify courses and what courses are relevant to become a counsellor, because it's a bit, as we'd say in our part of the world, a bit of a dog's dinner.
I think try is the right expression, Rory, because myself and some of my colleagues, we've spent a lot of time clarifying this, and then when we released it, we realised that it wasn't clear. So we've had great feedback in our attempts to clarify it, but the difficulty is, of course, that people will go to so many places looking for information, and it becomes even more and more confusing.
It is, Derek, and it's interesting. If you Google choosing a counselling course in a search engine, you will find that there's huge amounts of people, certainly here in the UK, looking for counselling courses, and some of them don't give progression to becoming a counsellor. Can we just say a little bit about that? What are the pitfalls and minefields that can beset someone who knows nothing about counselling training, who goes out and types into a search engine counselling training and finds lots of offers? What are the difficulties that they may face?
I think really, I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit today as well about the CPCAB progression route and another progression route. But really the difficulty is what it is they want to achieve, because as you rightly say, they're going to look for counselling courses. But does that mean that those courses will enable them to become a counsellor? And it's made somewhat more difficult. It's an unregulated industry, as you know, Rory. So how do we measure the benchmark? What's the measurement of whether someone is a trained and qualified counsellor? And at the moment, the benchmark seems to be the ability to join one of the major professional membership organisations, and there are a range of them. So I suppose the first question I would ask is, whichever progression pathway you choose when you study, at the end of it, will you be able to become a member of one of the professional membership organisations?
Yes, and I think that's interesting. And when we talk about professional membership organisations, and we're talking specifically here in the UK, we're talking about membership organisations that are overseen by the Professional Standards Authority. So I could set up an ethical body tomorrow, you could, and say it's Derek's ethical body. But it wouldn't be the same as an ethical body that was overseen by the Professional Standards Authority, because they're a government department effectively who set the benchmark of standards. And then what happens is the many ethical bodies within our profession then have to set their policies and procedures to meet that. And at that point, they're sort of taken on as an accredited member of the accredited register, and we hear a lot about accredited registers. So when you're choosing your ethical body, I think the first thing to do, Derek, is to make sure that it is accredited with the Professional Standards Authority.
I think that's a really good point, Rory, because my role here isn't to promote any specific membership organisation. That comes down to personal choice for any counsellor, their own personal decision. But that's probably the minimum starting point. Are they part of the professional standards? Their register, is it part of that accreditation? Because whatever we might have our own experience of different things in this industry, if we're looking in from the outside, is there anything that can guarantee anything for the potential client? And being able to join one of the professional membership organisations on that register will guarantee minimum levels of training, and that's minimum classroom hours and minimum client hours in placement.
And that's where CPCAB comes in, because CPCAB are a organisation who provides only counselling qualifications. And the counselling qualifications are set at different levels, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, level 6, to give a set of competencies to the person who is undertaking those courses. Would that be a correct summary?
Yeah, that would be absolutely correct, Rory. We have to consider a range of things. Our qualifications are Ofqual regulated, so that has to be a consideration in the design and development and the delivery. And also, as I've said, we need to make sure they meet the competencies for people to become, if we look at level 4, for example, jump ahead slightly, at that point in time, they're going to want to become a student member of one of the organisations. Does the course have the competencies to do that? Because if it does, then that is a clear pathway through to full registered membership on completion.
So I think you brought up an interesting point. You talked about Ofqual, and Ofqual are a government kind of supported organisation that oversees the quality of qualifications in England. In Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, they're slightly different, but basically the names are different, but it's basically the same thing. They oversee the quality of qualifications. And would it be right to say, Derek, that the reason they do that is so employers can look at the qualification and they can say that someone who's done a qualification, say, in Dundee, and someone's doing a qualification in, say, London, the standards within that qualification would be the same?
This would be correct, because once again, I mean, I think sometimes people, when they're outside of the education industry, might rightfully wonder, well, what's a level 2 qualification? What's a level 3? What's a certificate versus an award? And then what becomes a diploma? And these are all fairly clearly set out in terms of when you develop the qualifications and the Ofqual regulation. There are minimum standards in terms of the time, the content, and how it's delivered and how it's assessed in order to meet those levels of education.
Yes, absolutely. So it is imperative that anybody who decides to go on the path to become a counsellor takes courses that are Ofqual kind of approved, and that the courses that they're on allow them to join eventually when they, a long way down the line for someone who's starting right at the beginning. But if they continue the courses and come out and they graduate and they become a counsellor, they can join a professional body that is aligned with the Professional Standards Authority. So it's two ends, really, isn't it? Where you start and where you end up.
Yeah, very much so. And there is a lot of confusion because there's, I suppose, really a good example is someone might say, well, I've done a level 2 qualification, but a level 2 award might be 15 hours of study, and a level 2 certificate will be 90 classroom hours on the CPCAB progression route. So there's an assumption of equivalence. Well, I've done a level 2 already, I should go straight to level 3 now. But when we look at our progression route, it's clearly marked out what the content is and what the time input is for the student. So therefore, when we look at equivalence, we have a reasonable expectation that there'll have been the same learning opportunity in terms of working in a class with students, with a tutor there guiding the learning throughout. So it's not so easy to just say, well, I've done a level 2, so therefore I can go on to level 3 and cross progression routes between awarding organisations, because just saying it's a level 2 is not enough for it to merit as having equivalence. And I suppose the best example I can give you is if you do the CPCAB level 2 certificate in counselling skills, that's 90 guided learning hours, which for us are classroom hours with a tutor and with your class. You can do a level 2 distance learning in 4 or 5 weeks with 0 hours with your tutor and 0 hours with your class. So we don't consider that to be the equivalent. Yes,
it's really interesting. I came across recently a introduction to counselling that had no classroom hours, no tutor contact, no skills sessions, and it was effectively a workbook, some videos, and at the end of it you got a certificate in counselling skills. Now, that would be absolutely not helpful to someone who then wanted to progress and go into counselling, because there's, no tutor input. And crucially, you don't meet your classmates, do you?
There's no learning community.
Yeah.
Which is a critical factor. I think there's no opportunity for self-development as part of a community, because counselling training, we don't exist in isolation in counselling training. We exist as part of something. And I think that is really very, very important. And the classroom hours, of course, we've been impacted by COVID. So there's been remote learning, and remote learning is here to stay. It's not going to go away, Rory. Yes. That's quite obvious. But we would still require that to be in a classroom, if you like, in a remote online space. So like now, Zoom, we're actually meeting, you and I are meeting. And if we had another 30 people here, in theory, between us, we might be able to try and teach them a lesson.
Yes.
and that would be replicating the classroom in a remote learning environment, as opposed to distance learning, which is someone sends me an assignment, perhaps from a workbook that they've studied. I assess it and I return it with my feedback, and they perhaps resubmit, or perhaps they don't.
Yeah, and I think there lies the difficulty, because, as educators, Derek, we both know that vicarious learning, where students sit and work together and learn from each other, is probably the most thorough and in-depth learning, as opposed to just watching maybe a video or maybe just working from a workbook. It's when you've got the ability to ask questions, get different perspectives, ask your tutor. That's where learning is concreted in. Personally, there are things that you can learn. I've done a lot of work on my car watching YouTube, where I've just watched a video and got my spanners out and off I've gone. However, I think there's a big difference between learning how to cook a chicken or change a wheel than there is to maybe, use communication skills or consider your own personal development. That needs another person or other people in the environment, doesn't it?
I think that's entirely true. If we look, the impact of communities, if we take a step forward and look at the impact of communities in therapy, in group therapy, how critical it is to be amongst your peers and to be able to see the commonalities, the differences, and all those elements. And in a classroom, if there's a tutor and 15 students, then each student has the opportunity to learn from a community of another 15 people, not just an individual. And everybody brings a very, very broad range of experiences to that community. And the experiential learning is really, really key. If we look at some of the threads of counselling training now, the critical threads around difference and diversity, it's almost impossible to start to develop some learning and start to develop that level of curiosity and understanding without being in a community where there's some difference and diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes for, trainings that practitioner level. If you're doing the level 4 diploma in counselling, it's essential that at some point you see a client, you do supervised clients hours, you meet clients. If you're studying elephants as an academic course, there would be an expectation that at some point you may see an elephant.
I think that would be really helpful. It's a great example, and it pulls me right back to what I was just thinking. Level 4 and level 4 is not the most commonly available qualification, and I sometimes ask myself the question, why? Why can you go and do a distance learning level 2, distance learning level 3, but then the same company who's provided you with that cannot provide you with a level 4? And I suppose really the reason is because when you go into level 4, you are that close to being ready to go into placement.
Yes. But
of course, if you haven't had that quite intense skills practice with feedback, with all the interchange and the exchange that goes on with it, then you're not really any closer to going into placement than you were at the start. You'll have some knowledge on theory and some knowledge on skills theoretically, but the practice element won't be there. So in real terms, I think it would be unfair. Someone could say, well, I've done a level 2 and level 3, so I want to come on your level 4. Well, it would be actually unfair to allow them to progress onto that level. And sort of first day that they start on the course, the tutor says, right, I want you to work in triads this afternoon, and you need to start getting ready to go into placement. How on earth would they feel, and how would they respond?
Absolutely. And, I think people, sometimes it's easy to forget that we're working with, certainly at student practice level, working with, clients who've got issues and they're vulnerable and they need the very best help they can get. And to send somebody not equipped, I think would be wrong. So it's very principled and very correct that a organisation who's running counselling courses may very well say, well, actually, you've got a distance learning qualification, so we can't have you on the course. It's all about equivalence, isn't it? If they run a CPCAB course and then someone might have come and been with another awarding body and done the equivalent training, that could be something that would be viewed in a different light. But completely. If the equivalence is entirely acceptable, Rory, if someone says I've done a level 2 from another awarding organisation and they've done at least, say, 75 classroom hours compared to the 90 that we provide, then we'd say, yeah, of course, that could be equivalent. And also in terms of, for any training centre in their enrolment policy, they can talk to the person, they can interview them and think, yeah, these people are really, really well prepared and they're ready to go on to the next level. When we move to level 4, you yourself will know as a tutor, myself as a tutor, there's a point in time where I sign a piece of paper to say this person I 100% believe is safe to sit in a room alone with another vulnerable human being. And it's important to me that they have had the time and the training. And across level 2 and 3, realistically, if that's 90 hours and each 180 hours, there's a good chance that students will have done 25 to 30 practice counselling sessions with their colleagues, live people, which are observed and they get feedback on. Yeah, absolutely, because that's the groundwork, isn't it? That's the spade work. Yeah. The level 3 and the level 2 is the spade work where you're developing those skills. As you move into level 4, from my recollection of teaching it, it was more about developing the ethical side of things, the practice side of things, supporting students in their supervision, and getting them to understand how the theory is applied when you're working in the therapy room. And I just don't think it would be fair to take someone onto a level 4 course who just didn't have those skills. It wouldn't be fair on them. It wouldn't be fair on the people who had those skills, the students, and it certainly wouldn't be fair on the clients, would it?
I think fairness is a really interesting element of this, because it's something that goes throughout, the ethical principles of counselling, and it's something that frequently we're seeking and can cause us difficulty to seeking of fairness and truth. But someone might say, well, I've done level 2 and 3 and you won't let me go on level 4. That's not fair. But you've done level 2 and 3 with 0 classroom hours, and the students progressing through our route have done 180 classroom hours. Which one would be unfair?
Yeah.
Putting you all in the same class together. So it's, there's different perspectives and there's different stories to be told.
Now, to help us out, and this is quite complicated. I know my mailbag fills up quite regularly with questions about training and which sorts of training and who should I go for. And one of the questions that comes up a lot is, do I go down what I would call the craft route, the NVQ route? Usually maybe you go to a college, an FE college, or maybe a private training provider, or do I go through the university route, the more academic route? And that's a question a lot of people ask. And what you've done, Derek, you've produced a graphic, haven't you, which we're going to put on the website.
Yes.
We'll give you the details of that as we move through the interview. And it will be able to show the progression. So bearing in mind we're technically on the radio, Derek, if you could explain what the graphic is, that would be great.
Let me see how this works. I'm going to explain it, and I'm hoping maybe the listener has a chance to look at it as well, but they may not. So we're looking at something similar to an underground tube map. And where do we get on and where do we get off? And what are the stops in between? Now, what we've done on the graphic is we've compared two routes for counselling training. One is the CPCAB progression route. One is to study a counselling degree. We are not saying that either is better or worse than the other. They both have their merits and they both are more or less available to different people. And we're not saying there aren't other routes either. We're trying to show probably what are the two most common routes. And if you follow the CPCAB, what we probably now call technical qualifications route, what are the advantages, disadvantages? And likewise, if you fulfill an academic degree, an undergraduate degree, a Bachelor of Arts, but BA Honours, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Because in terms of the time input, there's very, very little difference. But there's a lot of difference in other areas. Quite frankly, one of the first differences is if you do CPCAB level 2, 3, and 4, you'll be educated to level 4. Whereas, of course, if you do an undergraduate degree, you'll be educated to level 6. You won't be any more qualified as a counsellor per se, but you can't dispute that a level 6 is a high level of education. Yeah. But then if you ask yourself which one suits me best, the technical route, the CPCAB route, is part-time study. And the degree route, for all intents and purposes, is full-time study. So it comes down to what is available to you. If I can't afford to study full-time, and many of our students are mature students, they're managing homes, families, and at the level 2 and 3, as they get back into education and start their studies, 3 hours a week is enough for them, in some cases 6 hours. So the opportunity for them to do a degree is just not available. That's all. In terms of, there's other elements, pros and cons. You can look at costs, you can look at access to learner loans, all sorts of things. Neither is better than the other per se, but what suits you as an individual? What do you do? And I would say really, probably the first starting point to look at education is something that once I start it, I can finish it. That's really, really very important.
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? Because, you know, I can see that some people may go on a course and find it not challenging enough academically, or on the other hand, they go onto a course and they find it too challenging academically. And I think that you know, going down an academic or a vocational route would depend on the person. I've just had a conversation with a colleague. She's more tends to go down the academic route because she's more academic. Sure. Nothing wrong with that. But I've spoken to people who want a more practical based, a more vocational based training, more sort of craft based training, and they could go down that route. But as you say, when they come to the finishing point, they're both counsellors. They both stand quite equally. And if you want that infographic, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, we don't have an episode number for this, but you'll find that this episode has been broadcast on the 16th of April 2022. So just scroll through and you'll find the infographic, and we'll also put some information on the show notes page to help you make a decision about, you know, where your training journey goes. I mean, I think this has been very helpful. What drove CPCAB to produce such a graphic? What was it? What was the driver for that, Derek?
We haven't fully achieved what we set out to achieve yet, Rory, which was to clarify. And we will continue to try to clarify, but we appreciate some of the feedback. It still can be confusing. The driver really was, there is more than one way to study to become a counsellor. But there are ways which perhaps will fulfill what people's objectives are that are more favourable. And at this moment in time, taking the CPCAB progression route as an example of a quality counselling progression route that will lead you to where you want to finish up as a qualified counsellor, and taking a credible degree as another example, which will lead you to where you want to end up as a qualified counsellor. And it's very, very important to, when we look at sort of academic degree programs, which are fabulous, it will need to be a degree with 100 placement hours in it. So you can, because you can do, say, a counselling and psychology degree via distance learning. But once again, it won't lead you to the point where you can become a counsellor. You may have to do a conversion course after that, or you might find you have to go backwards a little bit. And the choice to learn is always good. And I'm not saying that any time people spend on any qualification is wasted, but just to be certain that it's going to take you to the end point that you're aiming for.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Derek, because, you know, as I've said to many people, and I've had to deliver disappointing news when I taught, where students came and their qualifications, well, you know, they weren't going to get them to where they needed to be. And I've said to them, I said, well, you've learned something that's going to be helpful when you progress to the course that will allow you to travel the journey to become a counsellor. It's just unfortunate that the qualification you have doesn't allow you that travel. It allows you to go away with some ideas of theories and ethics and all that kind of thing, but it doesn't actually allow you to do the practice side. It's more of a knowledge base endeavour. And honestly, I don't know, Derek. I know that we had a conversation off air before we pressed the record button about having to give students really difficult news. Yes. about the fact that they work really hard for these qualifications. They proudly put them in front of you, and you have to say that actually they're not going to get them to where they need to be. And that's really hard for us as tutors, but it's devastating for students, isn't it?
It's very hard, and I can see why the confusion is there, and I can see why someone would be so upset. Because if I hadn't worked in this industry so long myself, across all sort of elements of it, I wouldn't have the level of understanding I have of it now. And I would think that a level 2 counselling qualification was a level 2 counselling qualification. Mm-hmm. I would assume that anything was badged that way would be comparable and equivalent. But of course, the distance learning is a great way to learn. And certainly I know for myself, as a qualified counsellor, I've done a lot of great distance learning since to increase my knowledge and develop my knowledge. But it never would have taken me to the point of actually becoming a qualified counsellor. And that's probably, it's one of the big challenges our industry faces right now. We don't, I think, to make it clear, CPCAB don't dictate what is required to become a qualified counsellor. We don't dictate, we don't decide, we're not the arbiters of any of those things. But because we are aware of what people will require and what their end goal is, we develop our courses to ensure that they can reach that end goal.
Well, I think, Derek, we thank you for the graphic. I do hear that it may be a work in progress, and we will update it. So if the graphic does get changed, you know, we'll update it on our website. And it really only leaves me to say, Derek Cunningham from CPCAB, thank you for joining us.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Rory. I'm fairly visible in CPCAB. I speak to people a lot on the telephone, I answer a lot of questions and email people. And it is when we go back as well, saying what were the drivers to do this, I am quite passionate about people getting the correct information, not just CPCAB information. You know, I don't see my role as to say, oh, just study CPCAB, there are no other ways, but for them to get the correct information so they can make an informed decision. That's the most important thing to me.
Well, there we go. Autonomy in training as well as counselling is a byword for our profession. So, Derek Cunningham, thank you very much.
Thanks, Rory.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.